Welcome to the Future Media Podcast. I'm Ricky Sutton.
And I'm Alan Chappell. And this podcast goes deep into the collision of big tech
and the future of the world.
We explore how companies like Google, Meta, and Apple are impacting each of our lives.
I'm an investigative journalist.
I'm a privacy lawyer.
And every week we speak with experts to bring the unreported details into the light.
Today, we have a special guest, Richard Gingras. Now, for those of you who don't know the name straight away, Richard's been one of the most influential people at the intersection of news and technology for the past 40 years. He's a veteran who's seen the media world from all angles. He's been a journalist, he was a digital pioneer in the early days of the internet, and as one of the senior architects behind Google News during his decade-long tenure at the search engine. Now, Richard recently retired from Google and is now continuing his journey in the media world through new ventures. But today, he's here and joining Alan and I to share his insights on the future of news in a fracturing digital landscape. Now, we'll be talking about whether he sees a sustainable future for news organizations online, whether that future is going to be ad-funded or subscription-driven or something else entirely. And as the very first guest we've had from the most senior ranks within Google, he brings a unique inside-out perspective on how the digital news ecosystem has evolved. So settle in. It's going to be a really interesting one. I've been really looking forward to this. So thanks for coming as we dive into a conversation with someone who truly knows the inner workings of both journalism and the tech that powers it and challenges it. So let's get started. Now, I actually have a question for you, Richard, that has absolutely nothing to do with any of that to kick off. I can see a glass in the background there, and it looks like it's something strong. Now, I do a podcast called Scotch and Watch as well. So what is this?
Well, first of all, by the way, thank you for the introduction. It sounded a bit like an obituary, but I want to assure you I'm still alive. Um, and this is part of the solution. But in truth, this too is a bit of misinformation, because I think it probably looks to you like it's a glass of good scotch, but it's actually just iced tea that I have decided to pose as an alcoholic beverage just in the interest of joining the full spirit and spirits of your podcast.
Literally joining the spirit. I love that. Well, you're going to fit right in. So amazing to have you. Thanks so much for turning up. And by no means do we wanted it to be an obituary. We wanted it very much to be a conversation about the future, because what we try to do here in this podcast is to try and navigate the collision between big tech and big media, which has been fractious and feels to me, certainly as a journalist too, that it isn't really working in the best interests of all parties. It feels like there has to be a winner and a loser at the moment. It would be better if we could find a way to work together. Now, you've been right at the center of a lot of that, obviously with Google News, which has been a critical part of, both the wins and the losses for the news industry over the last 20 years. So I wonder if you could walk us through how Google News, where it came from, where the idea came from, and how it evolved under your leadership.
Well, first of all, if I might, to what you posed about the, fractious relationship between technology companies and the publishing industry, I think that's important to note as well. I think it's deeply problematic. We live in societies that are polarized, as we well know. We live in societies that, in my mind, speak too often through memes as problems and through memes as solutions. Simplistic, not nuanced, and not effective. And in having conversations through memes, we also tend to demonize. And that's not constructive and doesn't move us forward. And I think the sad thing is that has become part of the relationship between the news industry and tech, and I think is deeply unfortunate. And I understand the dynamics. When I was first at Google, which was 15 years ago, I could go around the globe and people would almost bow down. I felt like there was a halo on my head because it was Google. That was absurd. It's equally absurd today when I walk in and try to have a conversation, a dialogue where I know that 2x4s are coming at my head. So I think that's an important part. of the kind of conversations we should be having in moving all of this forward.
I completely agree, actually. So can I drive into that a little bit? Because let's go there, because I think that is really important. So as Alan will tell you, I've had quite an interesting career. So I was the managing editor of a newspaper that sold 60 million newspapers in the UK. I've worked at Microsoft. I was involved in building Bing. I founded an AI company 14 years ago and exited it 2 years ago. And now I run a newsletter business. And so I've kind of lived in lots of different versions. There aren't many people that have lived on both sides of the fence like you and I. And I really view it as my job to act as a translator, a Kofi Annan, if you like, a negotiator, to try and bring these two sides together, because the world gets to a better place faster if these parties talk together collectively and collegiately. And it's stopped being that, because it feels like it's changed from an effort to build a better internet into a way to make more money. And that's how it feels to me. But I'm interested in your perspective on that.
You mean on the tech side?
Well, the tech side obviously is seeing huge revenue growth, but that money seems to be coming from publishing. And so it feels like there's a suffocation of the publishing side of the equation. But as I said, it's just my view. I'm interested in your thoughts.
Again, part of the challenge here often is, are we doing an accurate job in diagnosing the problems, in diagnosing how these changes have impacted our society, be it in the news industry or the society overall? And we should go there on both counts, because I think there's deep misunderstandings. And I don't suggest this to say that I know all the answers. I think one benefit I have of my experience is like yours, is I do feel that it gives you a better sense of what the questions are you should really be asking, right? Because it's always kind of go deeper and into the deep ingredients. But to the point you made, one of the things that's disturbed me in the dialogues, again, one of the simplistic memes, which I was at a conference in South Africa recently, and the opening speaker, a journalist, started out with the phrase that tech was siphoning ad dollars from the publishing industry. And I went, that meme again, because it's actually technically inaccurate. It's not factually correct, right? We had a very different advertising ecosystem in the world of print. We had a very different informational ecosystem in the world of print than what we do in the digital arena. There's almost no comparison between the advertising ecosystems of past and present. And so the notion of somehow that advertising dollars went from newspapers into Google is inaccurate. And I can kind of describe the disruption of newspapers very simply. One is the simple statement that a large metropolitan newspaper, be it the Dallas Morning News or the Sydney Morning Herald, in 1985 were the internet of their communities, full stop. You went to them for everything. And the primary reason most people bought it was because you had everything, right? And it wasn't really about the city council coverage. It was, oh, I need the movie times. I would like to get the stock quotes and the sports scores and the commentary and the fashion section and so on and so forth. But now we have the internet, and it changed all that. And you can almost look at it. I always keep trying to think of how best to explain this. Those of us old enough to remember the days of newspapers, right? We sat around at home and we shared the sections of the newspaper. And typically there was always an argument of who got what section first. And it was almost never about the front section. It was about the sports section. And maybe mom wanted the style section or the food section or whatever. But we'd argue over those sections. Those were the sections that drove most of the engagement. Those also were the sections that drove all of the advertising, right? And so what happened in newspapers was two things. One is people had so many other places to go, for instance, for fashion advice and fashion information and buying fashion. And similarly with all the other categories. So newspapers, unfortunately, got double whacked. One was they lost the audience for the very type of content that drove the advertising model. Because we all would ask, I remember I testified before the British Parliament, and I just asked them, I said, tell me, where do you go when you're looking for a new apartment, or you're looking for an apartment for your kid, or a used car for your kid? No one said the daily newspaper, right? Classified ad platforms. Well, that was 30% of newspapers' revenues disappeared into classified platforms. Interestingly, some of those are owned by big news companies, right? realestate.com in Australia is owned by News Corp, I believe. Stepstone in Germany is owned by Axel Springer, but they're not on the same balance sheet. So there's no cross subsidy for the news operation anymore. So, but let's just go back to that. So 30% of the revenue is classifieds. The two other major categories were department stores, but department stores barely exist. They've faded in a world of e-commerce. And those dozens and dozens of pages they bought don't exist. In fact, the ideal situation for a newspaper was being the major newspaper in a city that had 2 or 3 department stores, because you could basically name your price and sell as many ads as you could possibly print. Right? Gone. Another major category was supermarket discount coupons. Right? Our moms cut out recipes, cut out the discount coupons, went to the store. What happened to discount coupons? It's loyalty programs. You enter your phone number, right? So 75, 80% of the revenue of newspapers in the heyday, certainly in North America, where I know it very closely, where, circulation revenue was less than 10%. It was all advertising, and it all went away. And so you left, unfortunately, newspapers, that the only thing they had really left was being a news node on the internet. And obviously, without the advertising revenue that made it work before. But to my point, it didn't disappear to Google. It disappeared into the internet, right? The internet created this competitive content, and it created hugely effective advertising programs, cost-efficient advertising programs, auction-based performance advertising programs. And the one thing I think that people often don't consider is how powerful that is for the economy at whole. My example being small businesses. Small businesses typically didn't advertise in newspapers because it wasn't targeted, it wasn't efficient. But now they can. If you look at Google's advertising business, some 60+% of the advertisers, not revenue, but advertisers, are small businesses because they couldn't do that before. So I think that's an unfortunate misunderstanding. And when I get in policy environments and say, oh, you guys owe the news industry because you took all their revenue, I go, well, not true. And even if it were, well, we built a better mousetrap.
Could I be a little bit more nuanced in my question then? So I actually don't disagree with 95% of what you've just said there. I agree that the news industry was too slow to adapt. I think that it could have invested when it had money and it didn't. I don't think it had a longer term strategic objective beyond the next deadline. I think that was all true. I was there. Okay. So I was the first head of digital for News UK. So I was there when I was the guy trying to build the future, sat in a corner office and no one would talk to. So I have lived that world. So I don't disagree. Where I think there's nuance though, is that there's a big difference between losing your classified business. Obviously it's a financial impact, but it's not a societal impact. That's kind of something you can live without. If that moves somewhere else, society doesn't suffer. I do worry, though, that the quality of news information, the plurality of voices, the lack, the ability to fill in all the gaps between the North and the South of news reporting, all of that has disappeared. The various shades of grey that sits between left and right has all gone away. And so that's gone away largely because the news industry can't fund itself. And so as the digital news industry has moved from print into digital, there was a sustainable model about 15 years ago. We knew what we had. We knew who our audiences were. We were able to sell the advertising. We had enough money. We had to tighten our belts. There was no more big lunches and first class travel. That was all gone. But, we could survive. But that's changed because as the growth of the advertising market has continued, it keeps growing at high single digits every year, worth tens of billions of dollars. None of that is flowing down through the ecosystem. So your catcher's mitt at Google and also at Meta and also at Amazon has become so effective that it catches everything. And there's no money for anyone else down the ecosystem. And the impact of that is that the news industry becomes effectively silenced or ends up shutting down. And it feels like there's been one massive winner, which is big tech. And there's been a very, very clear loser, which has been the news industry. But ultimately, I think the loss flows down to the average citizen in the street who has less information. And I wonder if we could have done a better job of sharing the upside of the internet? And that's, I guess, my more nuanced question.
Well, there's an awful lot to unpack there. I mean, to the point where I'm not sure I remember all the points there that I would like to comment on. But let's just go to the core one. I mean, you're correct, right? I mean, in this disruptive, changed environment, certainly the backbone news organizations that we relied on are troubled and disrupted, and many of them unsustainable. And we should look at that. One point I will disagree with is that we do have a far greater diversity of voices than ever before, to some degree, to a problematic nature, right? And we should go there as well, because there's an interesting degree of history that I think is important to recognize. So let's kind of remember to go back to that. But you're correct. We need to we need to figure out how do we best, as a society, sustain the press. But again, let's look at that. And I think it can be sustained, and it is being sustained. But I think we need to kind of look at why. Um, to your point about the disruption and why news organizations didn't uh, transform more effectively. Uh, One of the things I cite across the board that's a problem in the news industry, both legacy and emerging, is the complete lack of serious business analysis, market analysis, that would actually allow you to understand what products do we need to build to fit the market, right? And on the legacy side, to me, the driving rationale for that is the business was so successful at that point that they were led by people, no criticism here, who really knew how to work the machine and cash the checks, but they had no sense really of how to build products for the market. The emerging players, it's a similar problem for different reasons. Many of the emerging players were founded by journalists, very noble, but they had no understanding of the business. They have no understanding of market analysis. They have no understanding of a business strategy. And they think somehow they're going to survive based on philanthropy or handouts from the government or some proportion of revenue that they somehow manage to extract from platforms. And all of those are false messiahs, right? So what I will say, however, is that there are business models that can work. Now, one of the things I did at Google, right? Many dimensions of my job. One was on the product side, being responsible for how we surface news in Google Search, on Google News. Second part was all the work that we did with the ecosystem, tried to do with the ecosystem, tried to drive innovation. The Google News Initiative, for instance. I wouldn't say it's been effective, somewhat effective. Um, but we often use this phrase, we need to experiment with new business models. I think that's actually a nonsense term today, because the business models for media are pretty straightforward. It's either going to be advertising or subscriptions, maybe memberships, maybe event revenue. The question is, which of those streams, which of those revenue models work for what kind of information product you're putting into the marketplace? So if you look, for instance, at large national publications, it's pretty clear. You look at the New York Times, immensely successful once they figured out how to play in the internet effectively, right? More than 10 million subscribers, doing extremely well. You look at certain niche information products, political news, for instance, very successful digitally. Look at Politico, look at 24/7 in Brasilia. I could name dozens of them because that's high value information for an audience that's willing to pay for it, right? And so high subscription costs, they've got archives that people are willing to go into because it's got legislative history, so on and so forth, right? Certain niches, environmental content, a very healthy niche for philanthropy support because it's very mission driven. Philanthropies are comfortable giving a whole bunch of money. The local arena is again a different story. And that's where, I think, as you might have noted, I'm now chair of a company called Village Media. I've been working with them informally for over a decade, as I did with Google, with publishers around the world. It was part of my job. Could I find companies that were actually being innovative and making progress such that we might identify models that others could emulate? Village Media is profitable and sustainable on an ad-supported model at the community level. It's a fascinating model, and I'd like to come back to that later. But my main point is this, is there are models that work, but to get to them, we have to use basic business strategies like, yeah, let's understand what people's information needs are. Let's understand what potential revenue streams there are for them, and then rigorously execute against that. But for largely, that has not happened in the news publishing industry, unfortunately.
I think that's fair. Alan, we might very well run over time, so let's accept that this might roll on a while. I'm going to offer you a perspective from the newsroom floor, which I'd be interested in your thoughts on. So I remember three clear events that I think were really meaningful. The first one was that I was actually in the room, I was in the boardroom at News UK when we did the deal with Google in 99. So it would have been mid 99, very early on. And the deal was, look, we'd like to refer your content in our search engine. We're growing very quickly. Would you be willing to do that, please? And we sat down as a board and we had a conversation and we agreed that we would, because at that time, what we wanted was traffic, because we thought we were a news business, but we weren't. We were an advertising business and traffic meant money. So therefore, we agreed that we would transact content for traffic and traffic we would sell. And we were happy to do that. So that was the first event, if you like. The three people that were in that room were with me actually in Madrid last week at a conference, and we were sitting down over a drink talking about how that was kind of the original mistake. We should have done a different deal structure. But, you know, we were an advertising business. We were just in denial about that. Okay. So I think that's the first thing to recognize. And you do have to be honest with yourself and, you know, navel gaze and accept your errors. And that was a mistake. The second event was the DoubleClick acquisition, which was when we kind of felt as a media industry that Google pivoted from being a search engine to being an ad business, because for the first time we saw advertising being controlled by the tech company as well. So it was both discovery and monetization were now kind of both being held by this company. And again, we weren't worried at that point. I remember the chief revenue officer of the company I was working for at the time ran in my office and said, Ricky, Google saved us. We've got programmatic advertising coming. It means we can sell all our inventory. Our remnant inventory will now be sold. We'll be so much more efficient. You know, we can now focus on building brilliant relationships with our audience, knowing we're going to be able to sell it. And so that was the second event. The third one really was the Google News Initiative and Google News and Discover and various other elements, which was the publishing industry then believing that this was going to be the solution to their distribution needs and their discovery and how they were going to be found. And what we found, or what we discovered, what I experienced and I saw firsthand, was the news industry give up three parts that are absolutely essential to any business. Both the discovery, the distribution, and the monetization. Effectively, news became a widget in someone else's assembly line. And so it was natural then that the news industry would struggle to succeed when its raison d'etre, or its ability to control its own destiny, disappeared. Do you think that the news industry was wrong to give up all of those essential parts of its business? Or do you think that that was right, but it just wasn't executed correctly?
Again, I think each one of those are very valid things to discuss, and we should look at them individually because, again, there's always nuance to all of them. I mean, your general question at the end, should news publishing companies have been more innovative? Without question. How much would that have changed things? I think it would probably change things quite a bit for those who truly innovated, as we know. And often that did not happen. But let's start with the one about the traffic. I don't think there was a decision you could have made differently, right? Because it was not the case at the time that Google was going to turn around and pay you to be on the web or pay you to be indexed in search. It wasn't going to happen. You know that well. I mean, Rupert Murdoch sometime around 2005 said, we're not going to be indexed and we're stopped. We're going to pull out. But realized that, you know, several months later that wasn't a very wise move. That certainly search at that point, and almost true to the day, you know, was the largest newsstand on earth that publishers didn't pay for, right? And it did send lots of traffic. I think the one thing I would say that has been unfortunate And I find myself saying now, as publishers are concerned about losses in incoming traffic, um, almost more important than what I was saying then, was often, as from my perspective, is that publishers weren't taking good advantage of that traffic for several reasons. They would have awful digital experiences, and they wouldn't spend time really thinking, well, how do we take this discovery traffic and convert it? I used to give these talks. I just started using the same phrases again. I say, when I look at your sites, it seems to me you spend most of your time designing the homepage, but you spend no time on the article pages. When the truth is, all your discovery traffic isn't coming in through your nice grand entryway, it's coming in through the bathroom window, it's coming in through the garage. So are you doing that correctly on those article pages, particularly if you know it's coming from search and you know it's coming from search? But I go to those pages, they're overwhelmed with ads. It's just, it doesn't tempt you to say, oh gosh, let's go back to that brand for more. So I think that's unfortunate. I'm now hearing from folks a greater desire to focus on that, as of course search traffic will likely over time decline. It hasn't yet in the data that we've seen and others show, but it depends on the content category, so on and so forth. Hard news, it hasn't much. If you're doing travel content, very different story. So that's the first one. On the ad stuff, one point I would make is the DoubleClick acquisition for Google was significant, but it was then and still is now a small part of the business, right? I mean, the real mother lode is search advertising. And it's a kind of a perfect model. In fact, one thing I would suggest that people listen to, there's a marvelous podcast called Acquired.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
They did, I think, several on Google, including one now about the AI era, but about the evolution of the business between, say, 1998 and 2007. And it's brilliant. And it's fascinating at how that whole evolution of auction-based advertising, the fact, for instance, that even in the auctions on Google search, you can't buy the top spot because we also bring into the performance of the ad, because that means it's a more satisfactory and productive ad for the consumer and thus beneficial to the advertiser. It's pretty brilliant. But that's really the bulk of the business. I mean, DoubleClick, I think if we had to peel it off tomorrow, and we don't call it DoubleClick anymore, and we may be told we have to, I don't think it'll matter much.
Yeah, the network business has been declining for, I don't know, 9-10 quarters consecutively. And another data point, Richard, just to bolster or to add to what you were just saying, there was a concerted effort to reach out to big publishers in the wake of the DoubleClick acquisition by John Leibowitz and others at the FTC. And what I'm told is that they were far more concerned with Microsoft. Now, in hindsight, that concern may have been a little bit misplaced, given how Microsoft has ultimately made its way within the ad space. But that was the concern at the time. And there wasn't a whole lot of pushback, at least if you believe John Leibowitz, that there wasn't a whole lot of pushback on the DoubleClick acquisition at the time. But I agree it's a small part of Google's business, but it is a significant part of the publisher's revenue.
It is, but I think the only question there is, were there opportunities missed by large publishers to build and own some of those ad networks? Because you look at the display ad arena. I mean, there's this big difference between, in fact, when we get to the point of Village Media, right, some 75% of our revenue is direct sold advertising to merchants and institutions in the community, right? Programmatic is a tiny portion of it and very carefully filtered because we don't want to soil the experience. But the ad network environment, as you know, is extremely competitive. But should publishing companies have done better in building those platforms, owning those platforms? I would say yes. But one thing I also know, because I've been in this business a long time, is the news industry isn't very good at working together. And you probably remember, probably even know Peter Winter, because he came out of Australia, came out of News Corp, had something called the New Century Network in the late 90s, which was a collaboration of newspapers to do some of it exactly what you're talking about. But it collapsed because they couldn't work together.
I spent last week in Madrid with 700 publishers, 770 actually, publishers, and that was my exact narrative. If you want to move collectively to the future, which you do, then let's move collectively. We can't be ants all running in different directions and expect to get to the same destination, right? You've got to find a way to collaborate, to work together. And the news industry, there's a phrase that the news industry says a lot of times. By the way, I'm an equal opportunity cynic, so I'm happy to beat up on my own industry as well at the same time. They say to me, yes, but Ricky, that's herding cats. And I'm like, I understand, but the cats are going extinct. So this is kind of your last chance. I think the sensible thing to do here is to figure out which way north is and realize that north wins for all of you, and let's go, right? And so there is, I'm hearing again that, this is something that they're willing to consider. But like you, I've seen 5 generations fail to do this. And so I'm optimistic, but I also have some scar tissue about a mile thick on this.
And unfortunately, by the way, in many of those collectives, and even some of them that are being discussed today, they tend not to work because the big guys won't play.
Yeah, the ego trips everybody up, right? So we've seen that multiple times. We're actually seeing that, we talked earlier on about discovery, distribution, and monetization. One of the things that I try to do for the industry is to break down something that's incredibly complicated and has so many different angles, but really the only way you can solve it, to your point about business strategy, is to identify major goals and target those. So discovery for news media industry businesses for the last 25 years has been search. And it was social for a while, but then social decided not to play. And so then it became all effectively search was discovery. On most publishers I worked on, it would be high digit 80% came from search. And a small amount came from the rest of the open web, and maybe, to your point, 3 or 4% came through the homepage, almost none. And that's mainly the subscribers. And so in discovery, if search isn't going to be the discovery mechanism for the future, AI overviews and various other innovations damaging that, what do you think discovery is for a publisher in future? How do you think their content's found?
I think here, too, it's going to depend on what kind of a news product you're talking about and what kind of market you're approaching. And I would concede that over time, my sense is that discovery traffic via search engines will decline. One thing I point out to folks is, Google's mission, for instance, was organize the world's information and make it accessible and useful. It was not, for instance, organize the world's websites and drive traffic to them. That was largely what it was, but it's not necessarily what it's going to be going forward, because what our users are looking for is answers. And there's also an unfortunate consequence of the open web, is there are lots of what I would call tragedies of the commons, right? I mean, part of it is what we had tried to do with AMP, with accelerated mobile pages, was how could we speed up pages? How could we force the ad networks into being higher performance ad networks so that they weren't blocking the content from loading? But a tragedy of the commons, I'll give you an example, for instance, and I think there's a good example to think of when you're looking at AI and AI answers, for instance, is the recipe category, right? You search for a recipe online today, and you get a whole bunch of sites, probably more sites than the universe of content really needs. But every one of them, when you click on it to go there, give you the history of the spoon and the fork and the history of wheat and how it's grown and milled and floured before you get to the ingredients, right? And all because they think somehow Google respects time on site and they have a whole lot more time to expose a bunch of ads to you. Not a great user experience. So not surprisingly, if you ask for an apple pie recipe, then Google is going to provide you a basic answer for apple pie recipes. And yes, if you want to look for 1,000 different ones, you can.
Can I just jump in there? I know Alan wants to jump in, but I'm just going to really quickly, and I don't want to put you offside here, but I'm just going to push back a little bit on that. And maybe this is where Alan's headed too, is that as publishers became more and more reliant on Google, they kind of outsourced what to do to be seen on the web to Google. They believed everything Google told them. And the narrative was frequently drive more page views. More page views equals more money. And so they regularly were told, go do this, go do that. Make your pages more SEO friendly. Okay, there's an entire industry, $1 billion thick now, of people who work in SEO in publishing. And it was all to drive additional traffic, additional engagement. And that's why you get, this is how oat is milled. This is how, a spoon works. It's because they were advised to do so.
Well, I don't know who advised them to do so. It wasn't Google. And again, I don't want to suggest by any means that everything Google did is flawless. I mean, I don't want to be naive or even disingenuous on that point. But I mean, I know my constant advice with them was like, don't waste money on SEO, because from Google's perspective, it didn't really much matter. Things like metadata, forget the metadata. We ignore the metadata. What we'll analyze is the content that you put forth, full stop. But yeah, you got SEO industries who obviously spin all kinds of dreams and people pay for it, and probably incur bad practices along the way. But I think it's also an element of, and it's not surprising when people look at the open internet, it's not like all those recipe sites came from newspapers, right? A lot of them said, oh, gee, we can make money in recipes, so we're going to somehow aggregate or manufacture a bunch of recipes, put them together in a nice site, and make a little bit of coin off of programmatic ads. That too is I say, kind of a tragedy of the commons. Everyone went there to take advantage, to the point that they soiled the space.
I think you're making a number of very convincing arguments, and I agree with a lot of them. The one thing, though, I would point out is that you may be underappreciating one key nuance. That often when Google was making the internet better, however they're doing, I mean, you could say the privacy sandbox, you could say AMP, you could even say some of the SEO stuff, that oftentimes what would get confused is what's beneficial for the internet writ large versus what's beneficial for publishers versus what's beneficial for Google. And what often would happen, in my opinion, is that Google would hold out what's better for the internet writ large, when the reality was closer to this benefits Google, and it certainly doesn't benefit publishers.
I think it is absolutely true that we would look at the dimension of what's good for the internet at large was generally beneficial to Google, and there was less of a focus on what was good for certain categories of publishers. Though one area where, frankly, we did put focus, and we can have lots of discussion about whether that was enough or whether it was effective, was indeed the news industry. And one of the rationales for that was, and I, have had these internal conversations, the Google News Initiative was as much something I architected as anyone else inside Google, was indeed a recognition that Google's business is better in open societies. And open societies are more likely to maintain as open societies if you have a strong press in that country. So there were lots of reasons why we wanted to do that. We figured also, if we could drive an effective transformation, I shouldn't say drive, because we couldn't lead it, enable in some fashion or another a sustainable news industry, then yeah, it would take some of this policy pressure off of us. I mean, that's like a pretty logical equation to make. But when we did the Google News Initiative, there were two objectives. Number one objective was to drive effective, sustainable transformation. And two was, yes, we should leverage some benefit from the fact that we're trying when no one else is.
I can tell from your end that you see a value and an importance for the creation of news, breaking news, analysis, conversation as part of the infrastructure of society. I get this sense that you had see value in that. Did Google see value in that?
Oh, gosh, yeah. I mean, we wouldn't have. That's my point from the interview was, I had mentioned, I said, look, we've spent well over $1 billion on these things over the last 8 to 10 years. and I got a snarky response that said, well, that's just like, a tiny percent of Google's overall revenue. And that's true. But I said, who else in the world was even doing anything to try to drive that change? Anything close, and it wasn't happening. And I don't say that to pat myself on the back. I think it's thankfully profoundly sad. It wasn't industry news associations. Who was doing that to try to invest in change, to try to drive innovation? All the questions you said at the beginning of, what were the mistakes the publishing industry made? And I don't look at that, as I said, GNI, I think, was effective in some areas. It was not effective in many areas, largely because we couldn't control it. One thing I think, and I've noted this, particularly given my experience now with Village Media, is on the revenue side with GNI, we put a whole lot of focus on subscription growth. Right? And Google, we even developed subscription tools as if that was the only model. We neglected to see the opportunity in the market, for instance, for certain kinds of advertisers that publishers could leverage, like local awareness advertising versus query-based advertising. So, I don't claim any particular success or pride at what we did with the Google initiative. I will say at least we tried, and at least we put some money behind it. In people's eyes, maybe not enough, but same thing. I'll say, well, where else was anyone putting money into it? Even governments weren't doing things with things like tax credits that they could have done to drive, more resource on the part of news organizations to be innovative.
It always struck me that a way that the Google and the news industry could have found a more sustainable way to work with each other, and this relates to GNI, the Google News Initiative, is that if it was recognized that news content had a special value to society, it was something that needed to exist, in the same way as governments require broadcasters to put out a certain amount of news programming per day. Couldn't we have organized with Google that a certain proportion of traffic was ensured to pass to publishers so that the publishers always knew that they were going to get a minimum traffic level? Because changes would happen at Google, traffic would drop 30% overnight. It caused all kinds of chaos for publishers. Was there not a way to just provide a stable baseline for publishers to be seen, given their importance?
I actually don't, because it gets artificial pretty darn quickly. And particularly if you kind of go back, I mean, obviously there are different circumstances. Today you're seeing AI come into the question, so on and so forth. But remember, all we did was drive traffic, right? There was no query that didn't result in traffic. We couldn't force people to ask more news queries. Like, as we've said often, the news queries are like not much more than 1% of overall queries. And by the way, when we measure that, because people say, oh, it's more than that, that's a result where news is in position 1, where we had a very high sense that the query was about news. A lot of queries are ambiguous. And on ambiguous queries, we do several things, and there would be news links on below the page and so on and so forth. But news queries, which is also the queries where you'd never find an ad, for instance, because there are no ads that wanted to go against news. So I don't think there was I don't see any effective way to do what you suggest without putting your finger on the scale of, it wouldn't be about driving more traffic. It would be, are we driving, say, more consistent traffic to publisher X versus publisher Y versus publisher Z? And that obviously can be very, very problematic.
Well, this comes to the meritocracy argument around, I think that a couple of things. So the first thing is that I think that publishers want to write the news, and I think consumers want to read the news. So I think there's a supply and demand matrix that makes sense. I think that's been true for a long time. I think one of the arguments that publishers would make is that returning a query response with Reddit instead of the source article is troubling to them. The idea that AI overviews writes the answer and gives the answer and doesn't send back to the originating publisher. Both of these are relatively new, but those have been coming down the pipe for quite a long time. and that publishers have seen their rankings diminishing and diminishing, and often without being able to find an explanation for why. Do you think that those changes have been because society's changed and the search algorithms stayed the same, or has the search algorithm gamed the system?
No, I think it's much more the latter than the former, and I can get into that. And by the way, one thing I wanted to point out, one is correct in saying that journalism has a high value to society. I think the one unfortunate problem is that is true in a conceptual way. It's not true in the marketplace for several reasons. I mean, if you look at the Reuters Institute reports, it's in the single digits, the number of people who actually have an interest in serious news. Right now, if you broaden it to everything, obviously, if it's content about news content about knitting, different story. So there is a mismatch, and it's always been a mismatch, right? Back in the days of newspapers, the front section didn't make the money; it lost the money. The other section subsidized it. But that's a natural element of the marketplace. Unfortunately, the one thing I will say to that, and I shouldn't because it's not monetary value, is one unfortunate thing that we see, that I see, as we know, and we've seen data for a long time, the declining trust in media, in news organizations. And unfortunately, what I find too often, this is provocative, but I've been saying this, and I don't mind being provocative. I'm 74. Thank you. Is when that comes up and people say, oh, when they start pointing fingers of blame, politicians saying bad things. Oh, we don't have enough media literacy training. Blame Facebook, blame social networks, but not actually stepping back and saying, if society doesn't trust us and we think it's valued, then we better build the trust such that they value it more than they do today. Maybe we need to step back, and are there things we should be doing differently to earn that trust? One thing, back to my earlier point about market research, say, have you actually done the research to understand who trusts you versus who doesn't trust you and why? Right? And maybe that might change how you do certain things. And we could get into a long conversation there. I've written some things on it. Not that I know the answers, but I think here are some interesting vectors to consider. Um, so, again, it's all much more complex than the memes suggest.
One underappreciated component to this story is that this story began a long time ago. I would argue with the cable news, in the 90s. Because as somebody who spent a fair amount of time in the retirement communities of Florida, I can tell you that the cable news stuff has done way more damage to the psyches of those good people down there than anything that Meta has done.
I think that's true. And I'll actually take you back further, because this too is something, look, I've been around a long time. I've been in the business 5 decades. It's not particular brilliance, but
Can we blame Reagan? I just want to blame Reagan. As a
Actually,
general thing.
There is a key decision there with regard to Reagan in 1987 that we should get to, but you could actually go back to, I mean, in fact, the wisdom on this goes back to Plato. I mean, Plato said, oh, the ideal form of government was the philosopher king, but even he admitted, more likely than not, they're corrupt, so that's not it. So he said, democracy is the least worst form of government. But what he also said was democracies are chaotic, and they are. And they will be destroyed by the freedoms they enable, right? And so if you map the progression, starting with Gutenberg, we look at Gutenberg, oh, was this the start of the Enlightenment? No, it was not the start of the Enlightenment. It was the trigger of the Reformation, Martin Luther, right? Challenging the church, disrupting societies. Most of publishing back then was about mysticism. If there was actually the first constructive component of the press was technical manuals, which stimulated the Industrial Revolution because people could understand how to replicate certain goods and procedures, right? There was no, as I say, golden era of truth. But to your point, the real point is, with every progression in communications technology, you end up generating more views, more opinions, more difficulty in achieving consensus, right? And so you get to radio, further. And as you say, 1987 was when the Reagan administration put a stop to the Fairness Doctrine. And that was the start of extreme partisan talk radio. I think hugely problematic in America's society, hugely problematic. And then you got to the cable industry, and there too, I mean, my first technological effort was I was working for PBS at the time. My mentor was the head of PBS, who, by the way, his guidance to me was, if you're interested in the future of media, Richard, stay close to the technology because it sets the ground rules and establishes the playing field for upon which media is made. That wasn't obvious in 1975, but it's obvious. It's an obviosity today, right? But satellites made cable possible. Satellites made the 500 channels possible. Ted Turner, interestingly, and I was in the room when he announced CNN before they launched it. And his vision was, finally, we can go deep on a story. We're not limited to 90 seconds. It was actually a nice vision. Ted Turner's a smart and nice guy. But what he learned, of course, was going deep was expensive and the audience isn't there for it. And so guess what? Chat shows make a whole lot of sense. They're cheap. Conflict in chat shows, even better. Right? I mean, in fact, I love the name, the Crossfire, for a chat show. Like, okay, let's just figure out how to kind of polarize and divide people. And then the cable news networks, because it was a tough business, said, well, we'll focus on a cohort. Right? So obviously News Corp said, oh, we're going to focus on this cohort, MSNBC on this cohort. And frankly, I don't have much regard for either, because all they do is demonize the other side. They are the polarization problem, right? It did start with them. And yes, the internet made it worse. But when I look at where the messages come from, I tell people, like, I have these discussions with folks. Maria Ress is a dear friend of mine, known her for ages, and she'll say, oh, Facebook was the problem. I say, look at the US. And by the way, why doesn't anyone in the journalism community ever acknowledge the fact that, there are these components of the press that are pretty goddamn disruptive, right? I was at a conference in South Africa recently, and I was with Chris Roper, who was editor of a publication in Johannesburg and is now co-CEO of something called Code for Africa. And he said to me, he says, the journalism community loves to talk about the public good. He says, what they don't acknowledge is that most of the journalistic ecosystem isn't about the public good, but is about driving against specific political interests, right? I'm not a big fan of partisan news because I think it doesn't help our society come together. If we're going to come together in this country, we have to build a fat middle.
I'm going to challenge you on those. So that's the point of these. And I appreciate your very considered commentary, but I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective. So the first thing is, and Alan's probably fed up with me using this line, but I use it a lot in these conversations, is that 4%, the US is only 4% of the global population. And we have a worldwide web. Okay. And the problems that America is experiencing in polarization is just not reflected in most of the rest of the world. So I'm in a different country every 3 weeks. And there are problems, but it's nowhere near the problem that you have with polarization in media in the US, which I think is there are a million different reasons. You've just explained some of them. But we don't have the same situation in the UK in the same way. We are headed that direction, which I'm doing my best to try and stop. But you don't have that situation in most European countries, although you have some outliers. I spend a lot of time in South Africa with the publishers in South Africa. It has a whole host of different problems around, obviously financial struggles for a lot of people that leads to a lot of anger as well. So I guess what I'm saying is that, first of all, America is a kind of unique problem in polarization right now.
And that's a fair point. I mean, we should also acknowledge that, around the world in the last 20 years, we've had 15, 20 democracies elect authoritarians. So obviously we are seeing those trends. But to your point, and it would be an interesting analysis to look at those countries and say why. Again, I look at the U.S. and say, oh, a shift in licensing criteria with that shift in 1987, for example. Or I'm forgetting his name, the head of the FCC, who now speaks with sadness about his role at the FCC when News Corp came to him and Rupert came to him and said, "This is what we're going to do with Fox News," and there was no objection. Now, those are tricky policy questions to make, by the way, but other countries tend to look at that differently. Like, I don't know the situation in France today, right? There's now a beginning to appear, all news channels that are partisan in France. I don't know exactly how that's happened differently than the United States, but I think it's a very fair point. The information infrastructures in countries are different. The policy structures are different. The mix of means of communications are different, and as a result, you have you have those significant differences of how things progressed. No question.
And I think the next point I was going to make is that we have a beautiful patchwork quilt of for our world, of different people with different opinions at different times with different reasons. But we have a World Wide Web that sits over the top of it, and by and large, Google probably runs that web. Okay, it's Google's web. It's not the World Wide Web. I'm going back on what I said earlier on. It's kind of Google's web. Google controls all of it. Do you think it makes sense to have one single kind of structure for everything in that over that patchwork quilt, or do you think it's an inevitability that a kind of splinternet is going to start to emerge?
Well, I mean, not surprisingly, I have a hard time with the phrase "control the internet." Right? It's an open protocol. Yeah, well, we operate as a search engine against that. We don't control what the internet is. We are seeing a splintering. The global web is no more.
Yeah, so
Right?
I want to drive into
It's
that.
quickly devolving into sovereign internets.
Yes.
Incredibly quickly, and in some cases for some reasonable reason, but also very damaging.
Right. Can we drive into that? Because I actually just did a huge survey just 3 weeks ago where I identified 153 countries that are either in the process of or have already introduced sovereign laws, sovereign data capture, and other things. This splinternet to me has emerged so fast but is now so endemic that it feels like it's going to be probably a new evolution, or if not, the end of the evolution of the open web. So can I ask you about that? Because you've probably got access to data and at scales that most people would never see. What do you think is the cause? And B, what do you think the outcome is of that?
I don't have the data, but I spent 15 years traveling the world on this stuff. I mean, as you know, the third leg of my work at Google, product news on search, ecosystem enablement. The third is public policy, right? And I had public policy experience in my background. I worked for the Carter White House for a period of time, so I spent a lot of time on public policy around the world. So I do have that window on it. I think it's largely this, right? The web happened, and everyone kind of looked at it a glorious thing, or not. Governments, I think, had no clue what to do with it. But ultimately they woke up, and every country, every leader of a country wants some degree, if not absolute degree, of control over the information ecosystem in their country. Full stop. Right, and that can be good, bad, or indifferent depending on their views and approaches. But I think that's exactly what happened. To say, whoa, this global internet thing is kind of problematic. It's impacting our culture. Right, our kids are seeing things from around the world that they didn't see before. It's influencing our political sphere. It's influencing industry, and we're going to have a say about this. In fact, I did a internal strategy paper once, and my main point was, I said, we just need to recognize that while we actually have developed an amazing business, but we are in the middle of everything. And don't be surprised if the spotlight is forever on us, particularly as a search engine, because you're in the middle of cultural change, you're in the middle of political change, you're in the middle of industrial change, and countries are going to have their say. And that's right now what we're seeing happen. In some ways good, and in some ways not good.
Alan and I spent I don't know how many hours we can count, Alan, covering the various antitrust trials. And one of the, to your point that you just said there, Google Many of the ways that Google spoke in the documents that we saw in the antitrust trials felt to me like they felt they controlled the open web. That was how it felt to me. But even if that wasn't a strategic imperative for the business, it does by default anyway, because of search and because of Chrome and because of programmatic advertising. Those three things, any one of those has an influence on the web. All three of them is the web. Alan, would you say that's fair?
I think that's fair, but I would also add YouTube.
And then the video as well, which is also Google. So I think when you add all four of those together, you have the four legs on a table, right?
Thanks for tuning in. The Future Media Podcast is a production of Future Media and Ricky Sutton.